What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 37 of Reframing the Narrative, and we're super excited to have a part 2 of an episode we released a couple weeks ago called What is Real? And given the recent events with Charlie Kirk and everything that's happened since then, we thought it would be appropriate to talk about who is real. And that discussion has many dimensions. The people we see on screens, the people we've been given to in our history books, really just examining who are the people that we're supposed to be looking up to and the people who are giving us our narratives. What's their real story and what's their motivation? And that's really the topic for today. And we're going to look at many aspects, as I said, between people related to Charlie Kirk and the people who propped him up and the people who have been propping up many politicians and many alternative influencers as well. And those people who seemingly came out of nowhere, gained big fandom, lots of followers, seemingly unlimited resources. It really should make us wonder how that happened when it doesn't appear to be organic. So that's my initial introduction. And Jake, good to see you as always. Why don't you take the conversation to the next level here and let's keep it going.
All right. Good to be back, PJ. And I think your cat agreed with your comments there. And we'll see if my cat comes around and agrees with what I'm about to say. But just to start about this whole topic around Charlie Kirk, I don't think our show is the kind of discussion that tries to break down what is real in the sense that we're turning our attention towards current events and trying to figure out what happened or anomalies in certain stories that were told. Rather, we're using this as a touchstone for discussion about narratives that we are given, that we are presented with, that we might hold for a while and that we might try and dissect, break down, and move on from, or ones that we discard because the facts on the ground might have changed, or we may have evolved. My favorite term recently. We might have changed in some way. So just for anyone thinking that maybe we're just going to be another one of those debunkers and say, you know, this whole thing was faked, or yeah, that might be our opinion. I think it probably is, but we'd rather be more thematic, I think, and just look at things like this and relate them to other characters that we're given, other events that are presented to us, and what they mean and how people respond to them. So just for my part, real quickly, when anything like this happens, yeah, I'm interested in what may have happened, but I try to remind people around me, and this is a good way to not get too much pushback from people who may be kind of in the normie camp, just following along, believing that these things are absolutely 100% just like they're presented on TV. I like to say, well, what really matters is how people respond, and that includes politically, that includes government response, that includes the introduction of new bills. We're hearing that there might be a Charlie Kirk bill, and we're seeing a lot of other kind of responses to what either happened or didn't, but whatever is perceived is reality here. And one of them would be just the firings that we're hearing about at workplaces, right? People that celebrated an apparent deleting of somebody, a character, a person, could be a human being that is no longer with us. But for the purposes of policy, for the purposes of emotion that people are feeling, and the anger that they may feel, and they want to get revenge or anything of the sort. I think we touched on this a little bit last week with 9/11. all that really doesn't really matter, right? Doesn't matter if it was a 30-06. It doesn't matter if it was a blank gun, a BB gun. Doesn't matter. What matters is how things proceed afterwards. And I think on some level, we've touched on this a few times, but there's some kind of consent necessary. So as long as maybe we touched on 15%, 20%, a certain critical mass goes along with this stuff. Actually, for going along with it, it's probably more than 50%. Then whatever was planned proceeds. But I think when enough people just kind of shut it down and say, we're not giving our energetic, whatever it is, we're not buying into it, then kind of like the fake Trump assassination last August, they drop it because it's dangerous and they're not going to go forth with whatever they planned.
I generally agree with you that the actual facts don't matter as much, but I do think it matters whether people believe the illusion that's on their screen. And certainly we saw an example of that in 2020. And again, I feel like I may be repeating myself from past episodes, but I think it's really relevant here. Everything that happened between 2020 and 2021 was a big TV illusion. And really, if people had just turned off their TV and ignored it, there wouldn't have been this draconian set of restrictions and lockdowns and shutdowns and businesses lost and lives lost from people doing unnecessary medical procedures and interventions. And so, in that respect, just as we've seen in the past with the fake moon landing and we've seen with 9/11, although in that case, clearly people did die and something really did happen. But even then, there's a lot of questions about how much of that was real versus, somehow constructed by energy or otherwise. So there are still a lot of open questions there, but the Parasite class has definitely been testing the public's gullibility in terms of what can we put on a screen that they'll believe. And certainly there's even a divide in the so-called alternative media space or alternative community, truth or community, whatever you want to call it, where people that you would think with eyes to see would definitely look at a situation like the Charlie Kirk event and say, "Oh man, that was so staged," and it was so obvious that it's a big psyop. And there are people who are going along with sort of the commonly accepted conspiracy theory. And I'll give a tip of the hat to Conspiracy Sarah. I thought she had some really good write-ups on this recently about some of these actors that we're talking about in the quote unquote alternative media who are establishing the accepted conspiracy theory, and then anything outside of that is considered fringe. And clearly there are the people like the Ian Carrolls and the Candace Owens who are putting that accepted conspiracy theory out there, and they have tons of followers, and it's sort of being cemented in the mind of the people who feel like they're awake on some level, whereas people who perhaps question that official conspiracy narrative, then they're kind of on their own in a small fringe majority. But I think that coming back to why does it matter whether it happened or not, every time the public consents and gives their energy and believes that story, it gives fuel to the fire to the next big illusion. So I think it is important to understand that when these events happen, we have to be able to look at them with discernment, and just as importantly, taking our emotions off the table and looking at them objectively and saying, does that even look like real blood? Does it make sense that something would happen on the side of someone's neck when someone was allegedly shooting from a straightforward position hundreds of feet away? There's many things that don't add up. But at the end of the day, what are the narratives that come out of that? What is the result of our lives afterwards? What freedoms are perhaps taken away because of something we see on the screen? I think back to when the Australians were convinced that after a big false flag event that they should give up their guns, and now they permanently have no access to having possession of firearms and keeping their government honest. Well, look at what were the key countries who had the hardest lockdowns in 2020? Australia and New Zealand.
English-speaking countries, yeah.
Yeah, and well, more importantly, though, in Australia, they probably locked down the hardest and had the highest level of tyranny, and look no further than the fact that they gave up their guns and were defenseless against their government entities. So these events do have real life significance when people both pay their attention to those events, believe those events, and then agree that the problem reaction solution is all necessary. So the Hegelian dialect lives again. So you brought up the Charlie Kirk amendment or whatever is being pushed through Congress right now, and that's not by accident. We saw the birth of the Homeland Security apparatus after 9/11. Everyone went along with that. The common objection to anyone questioning why you'd let so much government invasion happen is, well, I've got nothing to hide, they can come look, right? That idea was put out there in the stratosphere for people to be talking about and to accept as a common theme, that we're Americans, we live a good life, we do all the right things, and we have nothing to hide. And so just an example of where, yes, there was a lot about 9/11 we could question, and there's a lot we could question about planes or no planes, what really brought the towers down. But at the end of the day, the majority of people believed what they were being told, and then therefore they accepted the solutions that were presented to them. And I think in the same sense, we're going to see the Charlie Kirk situation come out of that with not only the potential for division amongst the so-called left and right and more civil unrest, but more importantly, we'll see that next level of surveillance and government intervention in some way, and that's what we really have to be wary of, and that's why I think it does matter whether something happened or not. Now, for me, as someone who likes going down rabbit holes, for sure, I want to know all the details and I want to understand it fully. That level of detail isn't necessary for the average person, but I think whether they believe what they've seen on their screen is really the determining factor of what happens in our world. And I can tell you, just having briefly logged onto Facebook earlier this week, I saw everything you would expect of people going back and forth on the accepted narratives of what had happened. And I just shook my head. Of course, I'm not going to weigh in there because it's pointless, but it's just like, yep, people are biting on it. People are believing it. And the controllers are like, cool, let's schedule the next one.
Yeah, just wait for that other shoe to drop. Well, a lot, you just fired back with a whole bunch for me to volley back, but well, not back at you, but to riff off of. But one thing, if you saw me kind of distracted, I was looking for something that I just saved to my phone just probably yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. When you mentioned the whole idea of privacy, I have nothing to hide. Edward Snowden could be a psyop himself, but there's a great quote attributed to him. It says, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. A little thing went off in my head, light bulb, and I said, I better look for that quote because it's perfect. You better beware because when you do have something to say, you're not going to be able to say it, right? And I think you touched on something at the end that I was hoping you would, and that's really, it's the whole idea of consent, not just to the laws and the narratives and all the things that come down after an event, but it's literally at the front end of this, you're giving your consent to that box, whatever it is, whatever the screen is, and you're saying, I get my information from here, first of all, and number two, I generally believe this stuff. And I think we're veteran skeptics. And when something like this happens, and then of course we could go into just one or two details about why it's so far-fetched. I mean, getting Air Force Two involved and making it like a state level event when this is a kid who at 17 was handed hundreds of millions of dollars to start an organization, and he didn't even go to college, and his audience is just taking down college students and out debating him. What did he ever do? What position was he ever in other than just shooting his mouth off? And yeah, he's very eloquent and kind of charming. Of course, he wouldn't be in that position if he didn't have those skills. But just getting back to the whole idea of the consent that you're giving to whatever screen. I have a T-shirt that I probably worn while we've been on the air before from J.P. Sears. It says Amish virus protection, turn off the TV, that I bought during the malarkey years of COVID. And that always gets people. I've gotten a lot of really positive reactions to that when I've worn that out. It's no accident, really. And they used to be involved with the flicker rate on TV. And many studies showed that you were so suggestible. You would go into a trance state, not a trans state. That's another thing. That's kind of a hot topic at the moment. Oops. You go into a trance state within X amount of seconds, within, I think, with analog TVs, like maybe 40 seconds, something like that. And with HD TV and now Ultra HD TV, I don't know how that works. Maybe you're suggestible before you even turn the thing on. So, yeah, it really comes down to, are you suggestible? Are you consenting to believing what comes through this thing? And then another aspect that is similar to something like 9/11 is when these things come across, whether real or not, it is kind of a traumatizing event. And the fury to get to the bottom of it, will the shooter be found? Who's responsible? Is there going to be there's going to be a manhunt? There's going to be, we got this clue and that clue. That's a traumatizing type state. And while you're in a traumatized state, you're very suggestible. And that's, I think, something that the controllers have learned over the years, and they practice trauma-based mind control in all of its forms, whether it's literally creating new personalities in people, split personalities, or it's just like on a microdose kind of level throughout the population.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. And we certainly covered that last week during the 9/11 live stream. But I think it's particularly relevant. And these two thoughts, or the thought you brought up and the one that I've got in my head, linked together really well, because I have to say that just along with questioning characters such as Charlie Kirk, who basically did nothing and was handed hundreds of millions of dollars to be a talking head, and his wife, who gave a very laughable eulogy performance, it was just terrible. And you have to wonder where she even came from, or he, if some people are accusing, but whatever, not what we're here to talk about. But that being said, I think about the people who did watch that video live, and even some people that I've been following as of late who I thought had discernment and I thought would see this clearly. And it also makes me then question, just as we were talking about some of these people who've risen to high levels of popularity. I will say that, for example, I was very disappointed earlier this week to watch a few minutes of JT Follows JC's mixtape. I had to turn it off because it made me sick to my stomach, and it was like the first time I've put a thumb down on any of his content. I was tempted to leave comments about, oh, you went full time, you're peddling supplements, and now you're toting the mainstream narrative. I couldn't watch it. It was unwatchable. And I was like, do I have to now be suspicious of this guy? Has he sold his soul to be able to go full time as a content creator? And look, I don't know if that's the case. Maybe it was a lapse in judgment. Maybe he saw the video and just reacted emotionally. Certainly that's what I saw in the few minutes I watched. But at some point, as I said before, as a longtime truther, skeptic, whatever you want to call it, you have to be able to take your emotions off the table and look at things critically and objectively. And I just don't see how you view this psyop as anything more than a theater and a stage production. Now, whether there were people there, whether it was a squib or whatever. I don't really know. I think I'm more leaning towards the camp of it was a big TV production or AI or something like that. Tip of the hat again to conspiracy theory for bringing up the very obvious point very few people are talking about, that if it was a college campus and a bunch of college kids were there, 80% of them would have their phones out anyway.
I think they did.
Yeah, so if it maybe that's old news. Maybe a bunch of cell phone video has been released, and maybe, I'm speaking out of turn, but it feels a lot like the Pulse nightclub or the Uvalde situation. Agent 131711 did some great write-ups on both to really question what happened, if anything, or whether what we saw on TV was a complete production. And that is all to say that you see a lot of these patterns repeat themselves in these big events, these big politically motivated events that have a specific narrative and objective behind them. And I think a lot of these people who have been given these platforms with a lot of viewers, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, are pushing the accepted history and then the accepted conspiracy theory. But I just really feel like if you're not seeing that there's a clear psyop that's motivated to get you to react in a certain way, then maybe you need to take a step back, take a breather, and look at it again. And I hope JT just, and since he recorded this week's episode, has come to reason. I don't know, but I just don't know how anyone with eyes to see, someone who realized the malarkey in 2020 was what it was, I don't know how you look at this and not say they're trying to pull another one, guys, right? But getting back to the idea of the emotional aspect, certainly we're all human, and if something does, at least at first glance, look real and could cause an emotional reaction, I can't fault anybody for that. But I do fault someone who is a full-time truther for not seeing the obvious patterns.
I can't fault everybody for not getting there at the same speed as others, though, because there is a learning curve to things, and it's almost like the stages of mourning. At first you might be angry, and then you eventually get to acceptance, and then it's kind of like aging. At some point you're over 40, and if you still care about what people think, maybe you have a problem. And you got to work on that. And it's kind of the same thing. If you really care about what comes through that screen, and you take it seriously, and you really think that politicians represent you, and that voting counts and all that, well, like you said, maybe take a step back and rewind the videotape, because there's still some learning to do. And in the case of the person you brought up, maybe he's really good on some things, but he's still emotionally, and I get this sense from watching some of his videos, a little bit invested in MAGA. And maybe he's just not there. But it's also a good reminder that we don't know him. Seems like a good guy. We don't know him. We know him through the avenues through which he reaches us, and that's YouTube, through a screen. And he's got to make a living too, especially if he's decided to go full time. And that's one way, I think, probably the best way to really judge somebody, whether they're an honest broker, or maybe holding back or twisting things just by virtue of, are they selling something? We've seen that with the controversy going on about supplements, DMSO and vitamin D, things like that. In the case of our own guest, Robin, Medicine Girl, the only thing she ever sells is advice. But the people that she may call out in general, they're the ones that you can track back to their attachment to certain things that go back to the pharmaceutical industry. And they could be unknowing, kind of dupes as well, because we're told all about how vitamin D has helped people, or DMSO has helped people. And in some cases they may, but if you're constantly harping on those things as being miracle cures, then maybe there's something a little suspect about what you're doing. So yeah, I think in the case of JT or other people that may not quite be figuring out that what we've seen recently is a psyop, it's a bit of a journey to get there. It takes a few steps, and not everybody makes that jump. I want to say making that jump to hyperspace, in the Millennium Falcon.
Don't strap yourselves in. I'm going to make a jump to light speed.
Not everyone really makes that leap all the time. Just make that note on your little chalkboard and keep it in mind as you watch their future content, because not everybody is of that kind of, maybe it's discernment, maybe we're just of a mindset, or maybe we're completely like just, I don't want to say black pill, but we're just skeptical about a lot of things. But then there's also traps in that sense too, because they're the type of people who are skeptical about everything, and they get caught in the minutia of what happened, who's this and who's that, and then they get divisive in their own way. So I think for me, a really good litmus test is just like, who's a uniter, who's a divider. And have you read the autobiography of Malcolm X?
I personally have not, and I would speak in admittedly ignorance that I don't know that much about him personally, but
Okay, loaded question.
Yeah, I figured as much, but I would say that he's another character that was put out there onto the world's theater, and so whatever his motivations were, whatever really happened, I would question whatever the mainstream narrative was, and certainly I know that he was a trigger point for a lot of racial division and unrest.
And yes, but the reason it's a loaded question is my conclusion and my observation is that once he made the Hajj, right? He made the trip to Mecca, and he returned, and his efforts were focused at being a uniter. That's when he had to go. He was no longer useful as an agitator, and that was the original role. That's why he got full leeway to say a bunch of inflammatory things and talk about the chickens are coming home to roost and things like that. Well, once he became a uniter, he wasn't useful for the powers that shouldn't be. So I wanted to ask you, PJ, who have you kind of noticed in anyone from ancient history up to the last week or two who was to you was a character or a role that your understanding of or your analysis of and the way you look at them has changed or did change?
Yeah, well, I will borrow a character that you brought up when we were off air earlier today, which is Ben Franklin. I used to look up to him as one of the great founding fathers or so-called founding fathers of the United Slaves of America. And I always thought he was such a brilliant mind and so revolutionary in his thinking. Of course, I was highly indoctrinated in everything that the public and collegiate system had put in my head, thinking that many of the thoughts that he put out into the world were brilliant. And when you look at his character, you really examine who he was, especially the Hellfire Club and the fact that later skeletons were literally found in his basement. There's a lot of questions about who he was and his real motivations. I think there's reasonable evidence that he was a Mason or some version of secret society elite who really his motivation was more on the dark side of things than the light. And of course, in the public school system, we've been given a different version, that he was a great mind and helped create our free country and everything that goes along with that set of narratives. And
didn't he fly a kite or something like that?
yeah, that too. So Ben Franklin, but I have to say that honestly, and I have questions about all of the so-called founding fathers, and I've referenced this before in our past episodes, that I think some of the physical evidence that is there that should make us question a lot of this is the fact that Mount Rushmore, that whole area, was known to have had more than five faces, and the Native Americans of that region, I believe they had referenced that as something like the six grandfathers or fathers or something of that nature. There's evidence that one face was removed, and I just really wonder how many of those faces and characters were already there pre-reset, and they were then a narrative was created and given to us about who these people were and how our country got here. And that goes deep down the rabbit hole of the old world, the reset, but potentially the end of the millennial reign. There's so many dimensions to that, but I've come to question whether any of these people actually lived, and perhaps they did, but not in the capacity we've been told. So I would question all of them, Ben Franklin being one of them. Thomas Jefferson, I also used to think was a great mind, but I would also question him and his motivations and his association with secret societies and pushing Luciferian agendas. So I've really gotten to the point, and this harkens back to our part one of what is real, questioning everything around me and really trying to discern fact from fiction. And it gets harder and harder in our AI age. And it's so appropriate that we talked about that right before the Charlie Kirk incident, because I mean, it was just so evident that there was fakery going on there.
Absolutely. That's a big part of this. And I think also whoever is running these ops, they're very much aware of this. And so there's always the trap, like I like to say, there's just so many traps that you could step into and they just snap at. Pretty soon you have like 15 traps around your ankles, or you don't even have any legs anymore because they've been hacked off. And one of them being just that the footage that was originally, that reached us, let's say, it has a bunch of anomalies. And then to your point about what Conspiracy Sarah said, that there would be multiple, like college kids, I think there was a survey, 95% of college-age kids are active in posting to social media on a daily basis, not just like they have an account. It's an integral part of their lives. They live online. When you talk to educators, well-meaning people in a lot of cases, about some of their biggest challenges, they'll mention that the students are just living online and it's hard to get them to interact in real life. I had a recent high school reunion, and the principal gave us revisiting people, whatever you call that, on a tour, proudly announced at the beginning of the tour that this year they've started making all the students put away their cell phones at the beginning of the school day, because they had noticed serious behavioral issues, not people acting out, just people not even interacting, not living IRL. So given that, we would expect to see a whole flood of videos, but what we got, if it was altered by AI, and then they step in and say, well, out of respect to the survivors, the family, or just because this is an R-rated type video, it's very hard to take, it's graphic, so we're just not going to abide by any more uploads of this because it's just piling on this. Everyone's traumatized, to reiterate that other point. Then those are the only videos we're left with. And there could have been some, to put it in a very technical term, shit fuckery involved in that. But people that may be hip to that sort of fakery. We're not going to believe that. And a bunch of people will get involved in the detective work, and they miss the whole idea that, wait a minute, what is this sparked in the real world? And one thing about the Charlie Kirk situation that I feared immediately, I actually made a public post in a couple of places on Substack, on a couple groups, was I thought it would be blamed on a certain type of leftist that supports Palestine, and we haven't seen that yet. But what I found is that this particular case and the suspect, the official conspiracy theory or the official narrative suspect, has something for everyone in a way. So the left type people are blaming the right type people. They're blaming Charlie Kirk for his speech and the things he said, or Second Amendment people for the guns, and then the right wing or red people are blaming the blue people for being a certain way and for their radical ways. And what we see happening is it's just further division, and it's gone on, it's festered for over a week, and there's, I think, these heightened emotions really haven't simmered down at all. So it's still kind of heightened, and it could play out in any way at this moment as we speak. And that's what I feared, because whatever happens in these incidents, and we will probably never get to the truth, except to know that there's a story and there's roles, there's actors, just like a TV drama or a movie. Whatever happens, the emotions are felt, and people either want blood or they want new legislation or gun control or whatever it is, and that has yet to play out. So we'll see how that works out.
Well, and I think that's why it's so important for us to have this discussion about not only what is real, but who is real, because you really hit the nail on the head about high school, but I think it really extends to everyone in our modern age. And I try not to be guilty of this. I'm certainly not as guilty as many people younger than me, but to not always have my phone near me or in my face. But who is real? Who are those faces coming out to you and telling you how to think? Certainly, Charlie Kirk was one of those faces telling people how to think, especially impressionable young college kids or late high school age kids who are forming their political stance, their so-called political stance. And but then, as I mentioned, there's the fakes out there, and I'll call her a fake. I think Candace Owens is completely controlled opposition. Her rise to popularity is 100% like all the other ones that I've talked about, where just overnight becomes hugely famous. Everyone's listening to her. Everyone's tuned in. Huge amount of followers. I have no idea what her net worth is, but I'm sure it's a lot. And
she married into wealth too.
yeah, it doesn't hurt. But I mean, everyone in her circle and people that associate with her or promote her, and they promote each other, I really believe that they're all part of the same group of actors, agents, whatever you want to call them, that are put onto those screens to tell people how to think. And really, how sad of a comment is that on the world we live in, that people don't think for themselves anymore, and they take the thoughts and opinions of these so-called influencers and they run with them, versus really taking that step back and examining and saying what makes sense. And as you and I were talking about offline, even people that we know of, I won't say know personally, but know of, who are longtime truthers biting on to the accepted conspiracy theories, it really just kind of tells me that there still is this need for all of us to flex our discernment muscle and to really critically examine everything, and don't listen to one influencer because they could be out there with an agenda. And maybe half the time they don't even realize they've got an agenda. Maybe, there's such a thing as what happens with actors, for example, MK Ultra mind control. They might actually believe the message they've been given to deliver, or it's, hey, do you want to make all this money and have a platform? Here's your message. I could see it either way, right? But the point is, I feel like since the advent of TV, people have outsourced their thinking to the box in front of them. And that's where who is real is so important. And certainly I've been victim of that. Well, not victim in the sense that I'm crying and saying that I couldn't change it, but certainly I've fallen into some of the same traps as many. And I look back at some of the people that I started following in 2020 because they were there and they presented and they said some things that sounded right against the the commonly accepted narratives that were being pushed at the time. However, I will say that over time, certain aspects of what they were pushing didn't smell right, and I said, I'm not sure this person's motivations are pure, and I'm gonna tune them out. And that goes back to us talking about where we're paying our attention, because if the Del Bigtrees and the Jeff Berwicks of the world have no one watching them, it's like, if the tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound, right? If no one's paying their attention to them, then they're not making a sound and they're not making an impact in the world.
I like that. And one thing I thought of that I've been hearing from people that have bought into this current situation, the current thing, as shall we say, is I felt like I knew him, right? Charlie Kirk, I like him. And you hear that about, for even people that may not be super skeptics, but just think about how you can observe people in your life that maybe are a little bit naive or gullible, and they fall for a certain politician. I like him. Well, that might be just a little bit of the key that opens up a little bit, that makes them more susceptible for everything else that role or that character dumps on them. And it could just be a case of, well, they're pretty good looking, right? A lot of politicians, like I can see Gavin Newsom just pulling the wool over a lot of eyes because he's reasonably handsome. I mean, I think he looks like American Psycho personally, but there is a kind of middle of the road attractiveness probably to handsomeness, and that ain't bad as far as gaining trust. When people, the first thing they'll say is like, but does that mean that you want him representing you? I think back to, speaking of high school, like I think one of the most effective teachers I ever had was one who I didn't like at all. In fact, I hated him and he didn't like me. And therefore we had to meet on an intellectual level. It wasn't about this guy makes me feel like I'm a teacher's pet. No, he was challenging me, and he was kind of a jerk. But when it came to learning physics, which is what he taught, that was the best thing for me, because there was no, I accept everything he says because I like him, or the opposite. I accept everything he says because I don't like him, and therefore he's right about everything because he's the professor or he's the teacher. That affection or that inclination to accept someone because you like them doesn't mean you do know them. And that's what I've been hearing out in the wild is, I felt like I knew him. He was a Christian. He said so many good things. He was for good values. And I think that's a warning sign when you hear someone, when you hear yourself or you feel yourself, think to yourself, I like them. Well, do you know them? Just ask yourself, do you know them? No. Just remind yourself, I don't know this person coming to me through a screen just because they have a microphone. But we ain't selling nothing here.
Selling nothing but thoughts and ideas. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. And I really love what you said about your physics professor back in high school, because it reminds me of probably the two most influential and also two professors that I had in my two different master degree programs who I couldn't stand either of them. And
Wait a
both
minute,
cases,
2 master's degrees? Are you showing off here?
well, I wasn't trying to go there, but I have a purpose for saying that. So the first master's degree was when I was much younger, in my early 20s, and that person refused to let me be spoon-fed anything. And this was when I was in a graduate program, and really pushed me, go figure it out yourself, go figure it out yourself, go figure it out yourself. And at some point you have to stand on your own 2 feet and you have to go figure it out yourself. And I feel like that really unlocked something in my mind that public school doesn't give you, to really think for yourself. You're spoon-fed ideas and you're tested on how well you retain those spoon-fed ideas, but really being forced to think for yourself is so critical. And I feel like it's not something that most people are taught. And so that was really influential in my life, and probably what primed me for being able to see psyops in the future for what they were, because I wasn't listening to the noise around me. I was processing what I was seeing and using rational thought to what I believe might actually be happening. And of course, opening the rabbit hole and learning more. But that being said, and I remember in the second graduate program, there was a particular professor of entrepreneurship, and I hated it because it was Saturday morning and I liked being out late on Friday nights having a good time. So I never liked showing up on Saturday mornings for this class. Number one, this guy was a ball buster. I couldn't stand him. But again, he pushed his class to really think for themselves and to really go find solutions. There was no excuses allowed, and he held people to the commitments that they had to make. And again, I feel like all this is so critical, and it's de-emphasized in our modern society, especially in the Western world. People are just, well, can you just tell me the answer? And actually, that's one of the dangers of Chat GPT, right? Now people have one more way to outsource their thinking. Now, we've talked about this
For sure.
before. AI can be very useful. It can be a tool. It can be a time saver, but it's also turned into a trap for people to not have to think anymore. And that just adds to the collective gullibility of people in our society. And that's why it's so easy to believe that people would see something that to us is so obviously theater and so fake on so many levels, but they're just believing what they're hearing and seeing on TV, and that's enough for them.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point about just exercising that discernment muscle, or muscles, probably more than one, to work in harmony, and that's a real key thing to do. And by not exercising them and outsourcing even your thought, sometimes even outsourcing your emotions or outsourcing your attention, we're giving up a lot of what makes us human and what makes us individuals. And I found myself over this last week almost resenting, because I feel compelled to look into what's going on and kind of debunk what's going on and figure out for myself, kind of, maybe not exactly what happened, but what didn't happen for sure. It's kind of a waste of my time, and I just felt like I should be exercising actual muscles, or I should be doing something, straightening up the house or decluttering, or working on marketing plans or something. But just whatever took me away from those, I almost resented it. And so I feel like I'm getting to the point where, yeah, maybe even the next time something comes down the line, I'm just going to go, yeah, well, they're all psyops. And just looking back, I mean, leading to this, what state-sanctioned major event was not a psyop or an op? Let's just stop at op right there. They all have been. We can go back to Pearl Harbor, Gulf of Tonkin, Kent State, I'm learning, was another one, all the way up to the most recent thing, especially like getting the Air Force to send off in the performances we saw on TV, and then the response to everything. And look ahead to the 21st of September as we record. We'll release this a little bit in advance of that, but the official vigil and send off, go read into that. But yeah, just it all drives home the idea that this stuff takes us away from reality, from our real lives. And personally, I'm at the point where I'm starting to resent it. And like I like to say, it's come to my attention. It's time to take action. And in this case, inaction, which would be detoxing from the digital world and doing things in real life.
That's the cure to many ills. And I was hoping that you were saying the vigil was going to be on September 19th, because that's International Talk Like a Pirate Day, and how fun would that be? Perhaps we need to somehow incorporate that or turn that into a thing online. I don't know. I'm not an influencer who can make things go viral, but I just want to put the thought out there into the stratosphere and see if it gets batted around a little bit. But yeah, I think that at the end of the day, and I agree, I've actually invested way too much of my own personal time looking into the details. And so in that sense, even though I have a different level of awareness or perception of what happened, the controller's already won because I've invested my own energy into it. So I've fallen into that trap. So there's so many traps, right? But it's also interesting to see the ops that they try to pull off and to dissect them. But it does turn it, like Robin actually brought this up when we had our episode with her. So many of these rabbit holes just turn into hamster wheels that distract us and waste our time that we could be using to more productive things, for sure.
Yeah, so let that be our appeal to everybody. Look inside and ask yourself, reflect upon what really matters and how much of what reaches you from outside of your own life and your own thoughts and emotions really matters to you, and then invest wisely.
Yeah, so I think this is a perfect place to close too with the famous Mark Twain quote that says, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect." And whether that majority is the commonly held accepted narrative on the mainstream news or whether that's the accepted conspiracy theory, I think it's time to pause and reflect if you're on either side, and even more so if you're giving too much of your energy to it, regardless of what the story is, when you could be doing a lot better things with your life.
Hear, hear. We'll be back next week with another show. And until then, make sure you exercise those discernment muscles.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.